6 p.m. Moscow time, you're live with RT International. Headlining today, two former Russian soldiers who are set to serve 14 years in a Ukrainian prison for terror charges are exchanged for an ex-Ukrainian pilot called Nadezhda Savchenko. As Western leaders praise the prisoner swap deal, then viewing it as an important step towards peace, they say. Nadezhda Savchenko says she's ready to return to the battlefield and fight in East Ukraine. Elsewhere around the world today, violence and chaos outside Donald Trump's rally in New Mexico, with crowds furious at his immigration proposals. And Iraqi troops mount a major offensive to recapture a key city, Fallujah, from Islamic State, with the country's foreign minister warning that ISIL is using civilians as human shields there. Live from RTHQ, Kevin Owen with you then today, this hour, and a lot to get through. There's been a lot of breaking news today. We're going to continue our coverage of the prisoner swap deal between Moscow and Kiev to start with again. The news is that two former Russian soldiers sentenced for acts of terror in Ukraine have now been exchanged and pardoned, but exchanged for ex-Ukrainian pilot Nadezhda Savchenko. She was found guilty of assisting the killing of two Russian journalists in East Ukraine. A plane with the two former Russian soldiers landed earlier at Moscow's Vnukovo airport. RT's Maria Finoshina reports from that airport.
This airplane carrying two Russian citizens, Yevgeny and Alexander, earlier detained in Ukraine, detained and arrested and sentenced to 14 years in prison for terrorism, has just landed here in Moscow at Vnukovo airport, just outside the Russian capital. We are waiting right now for them to come out of this airplane. The aircraft flew here from Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. As you can see now, a long-awaited moment. Their wives are here waiting for them. They haven't been seen or talked to their husbands for 1 year and a half.
We were waiting for them and hoping they would come home. We believed that they wouldn't be abandoned. It was so hard emotionally.
Alexander and Yevgeny's release and return have become possible after they were swapped for Ukraine's pilot Nadezhda Savchenko this March. She was found guilty for murdering two Russian journalists in Lugansk, in Ukrainian Lugansk, and for illegal crossing of the Russian border. Maria Finoshina, RT, from Vnukovo airport outside Moscow.
Those Russian soldiers, Erefiev and Alexandrov, were seized back on the 16th of May last year. Ukraine claimed they were serving in the Russian special forces, which Moscow denied, saying they were volunteers. Both men were sentenced to 14 years in prison for terrorist activities and were tried as non-combatants, as has been described. Well, as I said, the two have been swapped them with Savchenko, who faced 22 years in a Russian prison on this side of it. Our correspondent Murad Gazdiev is here with us now to take us through this. This lady, a colourful character, a very strong character. She's made so many headlines, but for viewers just joining us who might not be familiar with what she's all about, take us through it, Murad.
Well, she's famous or infamous, all right. Depends on what side you're on, who you believe. Some call her, you know, an overzealous nationalist. Others call her a staunch patriot. Some will call her in love with war. Others a defender of Ukraine. Of course,
you've seen her in real life. What did you think about her?
Well, again, you know, it's up for the viewer to decide here. She became famous in that episode, June 2014. The civil war in Ukraine had just begun, and fighting was in full swing. A checkpoint was hit by artillery fire. At that checkpoint were civilians as well as two Russian journalists. During her sentencing here in Russia, the court found that she willfully, knowingly directed that artillery fire at that checkpoint. She was the spotter. She corrected artillery fire, made sure those shells hit that checkpoint. And those two Russian journalists, died, as well as other civilians. Yet, even in their last moments, they continued doing what they loved. Savchenko denied responsibility for being the spotter there, for directing that artillery fire at that checkpoint. She says she was there on the front lines, but she was merely a medic. Something that's, something that's not assisted by her call sign, her radio call sign, which was bullet. She herself, though, she has a very rich history in the whole military sector. She enlisted at an early age. She was a radio operator, transferred to airborne forces, went off as a volunteer to serve, to fight in Iraq, the American invasion, the British invasion there. She fought there, she came back, enlisted as a pilot. She went through pilot training, became a helicopter pilot. Eventually, when the civil war in eastern Ukraine started, she went off there, joined the IDA battalion, which was a volunteer battalion financed by a Ukrainian oligarch. And that's how she ended up.
Well, talking about how she's grabbed the headlines, a lot of people are talking about this. And I go back, I'm sort of pushing you on it, but I go back to the fact that you've seen this woman in real life. I say it's important because you can't judge somebody just by the person you see in front of the camera, and the cameras are clicking. Maybe they're fired up for that, maybe they're putting on a show. Maybe that's what they're like in real life. Now, you've had more access to her than certainly most of the public watching here, or I have. You were there for a while covering some of her trial that caught a lot of headlines. Her behaviour, even today, seemed to be rather erratic at times. Now, is that the same when the cameras are off, is my question, because you've seen her in real life?
Well, we've only seen her with the cameras on, but and I was at her sentencing, and certainly the right word is erratic. It really was a spectacle. The media milked it for all it was worth. For example, Savchenko herself, one moment she'd be sitting there, mournful, depressed. The next moment, and there would be no switch, in just a second, she'd be happy, laughing or shouting, singing, flirting with the guards. And, there was no trigger. She is very erratic. Maybe she found, incarceration very difficult. According to all reports, she was like this beforehand. She quite a fearful figure in the ranks of the Ukrainian military, apparently, according to people who knew her. The media's coverage, though, it fed on all of this every single time.
Especially when it came to the end of that trial.
Exactly. Every time she flipped off the judge, for example. And, in fact, we've got videos of this. Let's take a look.
Перекладіть, будь ласка, мій останній. Горіла шина, палала, горіла шина, палала, там барикада, стояла там барикада.
Wasn't only that, it was swearing, shouting homophobic slurs at the judges, but the media, Savchenko can do no evil. If you listen to the Western media, especially Ukrainian media, innocent by default. Nobody, not a lot of concern about the charges that innocent civilians, people, 2 journalists died at her hands. She didn't pull the trigger, but she pointed the barrel of the gun. Not a lot of thought about that. And, politicians, officials, very high-ranked, high-profile officials all coming out in support of Savchenko. So certainly the media story was something else entirely. But she was released eventually, and you'd never guess this. She was released, she was pardoned by Vladimir Putin at the request of the relatives of the 2 dead journalists, who said that, it'd be fine to let her go.
More than 2 months ago, on the 23rd of March, you asked me to pardon Savchenko, who was sentenced by a Russian court. I'd like to thank you for your views and express hope that decisions of that kind, driven first and foremost by humanism, will lead to de-escalation in the conflict zone and will help avoid such horrible and useless losses. Thank you very much.
She's now in Ukraine, and judging by, her first words, her first appearances, just as erratic as ever, and already saying she's ready to go fight again in Eastern Ukraine.
Which you think would be bad news to people like Federica Mogherini of the EU. Maybe she hadn't heard what Savchenko had to say as soon as she came off that plane, say she was ready to get fighting again if need be. I think she wasn't saying proverbially. I think she was probably saying physically, if called up to go into the East again. Odd, though, because thanks for that, Murat. Top EU officials didn't waste any time in celebrating the news, indeed, that she had comeback and her return there. It was seen as a step towards peace in the country's east. And Nadezhda Savchenko now is in London to give us some of the political feedback there from the EU. What's been said then?
Well, Kevin, certainly this is a highly politicized and widely publicized case here in Europe and throughout the West. And of course, naturally, the comments of celebration are beginning to come in with really any kind of commentary regarding the two Russian journalists who lost their lives remaining on the sidelines. We've already heard from the president of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz. He tweeted that we have been waiting for Nadezhda Savchenko's freedom for a long time. A good signal and news today for her family, friends, and whole Ukraine. We've also heard from the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, who has tweeted, Nadezhda Savchenko is free and back in Ukraine. Long-awaited good news that the EU celebrates together with her country. We've also heard from Germany. The Foreign Office there tweeted that the Foreign Minister Steinmeier is relieved by the release of Nadezhda Savchenko. Great news for which we had to work for a long time. But of course, as has been mentioned earlier, this also comes at a time where Nadezhda Savchenko is also saying she would do it all over again. Let's take a listen.
Але я завжди готова покласти своє життя ще раз на полі бою за Україну.
This, of course, has been a widely discussed case. Many times, of course, we've seen in Europe and the West, really this as a symbol. Savchenko's case is an example of this anti-Russian fighter being incarcerated in Russia, and they kept, regardless of the context of her case, it seems, to continue to call for her release. Now this has occurred, of course, and it's going to be interesting to see what kind of aftermath this has in terms of the relationship between the European Union and Russia now, specifically, of course, in terms of the Ukrainian crisis and conflict, but also in the bigger picture as well.
Yeah, indeed. OK, thanks for the update there from London for now, Nadezhda Savchenko now. So, despite being found complicit in the killing of the two Russian journalists, as sentenced by the Russian court, Savchenko has nonetheless become a hero in Ukraine. President Petro Poroshenko today awarded her a Hero of Ukraine medal. He called the former pilot a symbol of Ukraine's courage and heroism. He also thanked Western countries for their support of Savchenko. Well, let's get some thoughts about that. James Patras is from Bingham University, and he's on the line with us now. In what was perhaps a coincidence today, didn't go unmissed. All this has happened today, the timing of it. What is the second anniversary, James, of Petro Poroshenko's coming to power there? Nice time for a photo opportunity, or is that being too cynical?
I think this salute to Savchenko is a cover-up of the deep resentment and disillusion of the vast majority of Ukrainians, particularly in Kiev. The polls indicate that Poroshenko and his team in the cabinet have less than double-digit support today. They are discredited for corruption, and they have to dredge up this beer hall demagogue that pretends to be some kind of a hero. I don't think this will carry very much weight. I think the fact of the matter is that Savchenko is engaged in demagoguery, an attempt by Poroshenko to neutralize the support by the neo-fascists who've been mobilizing in the street in Maidan Square, demanding the government take some decisive action, and the government is not in a position to challenge anyone, Russia, the Eastern Ukraine, or anybody else. And the use and abuse of Savchenko is a cover-up for the impotence that characterizes the Poroshenko regime in decay and disillusion.
So, in other words, she's being used as a pawn in the game here, as you see it, yeah?
Yes, I think she doesn't represent anything significant for the West. It's window dressing to say to the public that things are not all bad in the Ukraine. They are not all just mooching on IMF loans that disappear in the pockets of the oligarch. Something is going on positive, and they dredge out this beer hall brawler and salute her as some kind of symbol of a Ukrainian country in victory, and no one believes that. I think this is all a very farcical exhibition.
Let's try and be optimistic. There's a saying: a glass is half full, not half empty. I guess you see there's nothing to go on here regarding some kind of rapprochement between Ukraine and Russia in this swap that's been agreed today. Both presidents doing the necessary pardoning. You don't think things are going to get any easier anytime soon, then?
No, I think Poroshenko has nothing to offer his people. The bellicose attitude toward Russia is totally without any substance. Russia is reaching agreements with some of the countries that originally agreed to sanctions. Germany, for example, is signing big on oil contracts with Russia. Other countries like France are reconsidering their policies toward Russia. So the Ukraine has nothing going for it as far as undermining Russia or even...
Nonetheless, though, we just heard from London there have been a number of top EU officials there praising Savchenko's release. They didn't say much about the Russian prisoners that have been pardoned, but certainly a lot to say about Savchenko and hailing that. Are you surprised by that? Being, end of the day, she was found guilty of being complicit in the murder of 2 journalists doing their job by a Russian court.
Now, on my side, in the U.S., very few journalists, even in the capitalist press, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, are very happy with the murder of the journalists. What their editors may say is one thing, but no journalist wants to be a target of a regime when they are covering war stories. So I think this celebration is strict, formal activity by government officials and really doesn't represent the journalists in the United States or Europe.
James, you're painting it as rather a circus. Let's follow on from that. Just earlier on, Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko did use the opportunity to say that Kiev will reclaim Crimea and southeastern Russia. That's on top, of course, of what Savchenko had to say about going back to fight anytime soon. Let's listen to that, and I'll come straight back to you for a final thought.
We've brought back Nadezhda Savchenko, and we'll also bring back the Donetsk region and Crimea under Ukrainian rule.
Oh, sorry, James, to stop you in your throw there. We just played our viewers a very quick clip of President Poroshenko saying exactly what I said now, that he would, his aim would be to get Crimea back and the east of Ukraine. We didn't hear what you had to say to that, but with those words ringing in your ears, what are your thoughts for the future there? Empty words, wishful thinking, or something to worry about?
There's something more colorful. It's verbal masturbation. There is absolutely nothing that resonates with the speeches of Poroshenko. Nobody in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, are the Balkans that believes Poroshenko. Poroshenko is on the way out sooner or later. The Ukrainian people may have been fooled once, but the second time around, there's widespread discontent. They're calling for new elections. The only problem is that the extreme right is in the streets and preparing to replace Poroshenko with the more belligerent attitude, which will lead to a military debacle if they decide to follow up on it.
Retired Professor James Petras from Binghamton University, thanks for your thoughts, educated thoughts on the programme today about this big story we're covering. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're with RT after the break. Let's look at some other stories today. Donald Trump's latest presidential campaign rally draws crowds and cheering, but also tear gas and smoke grenades too. I'll tell you why.